Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 15 for our Bible class this morning. If you're visiting with us, we're in the middle of a study on the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, really kind of one book combined that's just been split into two parts. We've really been talking about Saul more specifically the past couple weeks and just seeing how I wouldn't say he started off great and tailed off. We've kind of seen enough evidence to really know his type of character, and just Saul's just one of those interesting figures. You know, he's not. I don't know that he's inherently evil like certain characters of the Bible, but you can see his flaws very clearly. We have a lot about him to just see how his failings and really, especially in this chapter, we're going to see kind of the final straw that's going to even though Samuel's already told him that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him. This is really just icing on the cake. And but again, I don't see Saul as this, terribly, wicked from the very beginning. Never was good at all. He's just very flawed, and I see a lot of things that he does and things that I do and things that we can do. These are not just completely wicked decisions. These are excuses, and some of the stuff that he does are easily achieved by all of us. Some of the things that we do as well. So kind of an interesting character to study as we go. So we're in chapter 15. Here we go. Chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, and we'll just kind of read together and talk about it as we go through. We kind of get the introduction to the story right here. Samuel told Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people Israel. Now listen to the words of the Lord." Saul's got a mission here. "This is what the Lord of armies says. I witnessed what the Amalekites did to the Israelites when they opposed them along the way as they were coming out of Egypt. Now go and attack the Amalekites, completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, infants and nursing babies, oxen, sheep, camels, and donkeys." What's he talking about here? What's this history with the Amalekites? Can anyone refresh us? Coming through when? What part of their history? Literally, like the chapter after the Red Sea crossing, and I think it's chapter 15 is the Song of Moses, and then it's chapter 16. I mean, they've just been delivered from Egypt, and then here come these Amalekites back in Exodus, and they come and attack some of kind of the rear part of their. I mean, obviously there's thousands and thousands of people, so there's a long line, and they come and attack kind of the slow ones in the rear of the column. And then you have this whole battle scene where Joshua is sent out with the soldiers to fight the Amalekites. And throughout the day, and Moses kind of looked out over them, and throughout the day, when Moses had his hands up, they were winning. But when he let his hands down, they started losing. So Aaron and another man, they held Moses' hands up the entire day just to make sure that they kept on winning this battle against the Amalekites. But the main thing that we're kind of focused on here is God witnessed what they did, and that was to attack a weak and vulnerable people when they were at their most vulnerable. The Amalekites, instead of just letting him go, letting him pass by. I mean, this people. I mean, I think clearly was not a threat to them. They were just barely made it out of Egypt, and they're not heading toward the land of the Amalekites. They're heading a different direction. Yet here come these wicked Amalekites ready to oppose them and attack them. And God has remembered this. He has not forgotten about this people that did that. And then for generations after, they were still enemies of the Israelites. So now we have, with that history in mind, now we have some justice coming around. This is really what this is. I know people, maybe those that do not believe in the Bible or kind of want to find flaws in it. They see this and say, "This is evil, genocide. How could a God do this?" Well, this is really justice when you put it into big picture historical terms. Those people had come and attacked Israel and were willing to wipe them out and kill all of their people, innocent or not. So this is just, for lack of a better word, karma coming back on them. This is God punishing and enacting justice on them for doing exactly for the same thing that they did way back in Exodus. So I don't see this as evil or a unjust God. This is God enacting the same justice and wanting to completely destroy them and not spare them, because the Amalekites did not spare Israel. Of course, they're one of those nations that's always listed as ones that were kind of marked out for destruction when they came into Canaan. So this is we're finally getting to a point where God can, of course, in his mercy and wisdom, He's given them a long time to repent or turn back, and they haven't. So this is their time to have justice come upon them. If you look there at the map, the Amalekites were kind of to their southern border. Not a very large or mighty nation. This is kind of a wilderness area, so not they weren't quite as mighty and powerful as the Philistines or some of the others that lived in a better area. This is kind of a dry and wilderness. I mean, think about when they were wandering in the wilderness. They were wandering through that area to the south of Israel proper. So Saul's got this mission. He summons the troops, counted them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men, a very mighty force, a lot bigger than some of the forces we've seen in the previous chapters. So Saul this seems to be maybe several years later, more into his reign, and he's consolidated power a little bit more. He has a much larger force. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set up an ambush in the wadi. And then he warned the Kenites, since you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, go on and leave. Get away from the Amalekites, or I'll sweep you away with them. So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. So we have this kind of contrasting peoples. You had the Amalekites that wickedly attacked Israel when they were weak, and then here were the Kenites that helped them. Who was related, I guess? Who are the Kenites? Anyone know? Who were they kind of related to or connected to? Moses' father-in-law, yeah. He was known as the Midianites and Kenites are kind of, we don't know exactly the difference between the two too well. They seem to be kind of interchangeable terms. So these were relations of Moses' father-in-law, who, if you remember, did show the Israelites kindness and worked with them and helped them. So you have those two contrasting peoples. And it makes sense. We have this one group that was wicked, and they are going to get punished, but the one group that did help them and was not wicked in that way, they are not going to get swept away. They are given a chance to separate and not get mixed up with this whole retribution. And the Kenites were smart. They withdrew from the Amalekites. So verse 7, then Saul struck down the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is next to Egypt. So if you remember, Amalek was to the south of Israel, and he basically pushed them all the way down even farther, kind of southwest, all the way to the border of Egypt, just completely decimated them. He captured King Agag of Amalek alive, but he completely destroyed all the rest of the people with the sword. Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and choice animals, as well as the young rams and the best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless and unwanted things. So what was one of the things that Samuel had told Saul? I guess a couple of the things.
Kill everything.
So verse 3, let's see. Attack the Amalekites, completely destroy everything, do not spare them. Let's see. Utterly destroy, yeah, even better there. So even stronger wording. So he captured King Agag, verse 8, but he completely destroyed all the rest of the people with the sword. But we see that that's not exactly what happened. He spared Agag, and he spared a lot of the best of the animals and things. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless things. So you can already see kind of the conflict here, right? We see the instructions and we see how they were carried out, and they are definitely. I mean, the wording there is unmistakable. We already see that was not carried out exactly as it was supposed to be. So of course, here comes Samuel, and God coming to Samuel. He says, "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me, and he has not carried out my instructions." So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. Do you remember what Samuel promised in his final speech? What did he promise that he would never cease doing? Interceding. He talked about, I'm not going to stop crying out to you and teaching you what's right. And Samuel's reactions here, I think, are also kind of interesting to look at. I mean, he's not just disappointed and just whatever. He is very emotional throughout this entire thing. He becomes angry and he cries to the Lord all night. I mean, why else would he be angry? He's not angry at God, I don't think. He's angry at Saul because he knows the blatant disobedience. I mean, it goes against everything that Samuel's taught him. Samuel's tried to, I mean, he's been crying out and interceding for the people. He's been doing that for Saul his entire life, Samuel's entire life, and then and then here's God. Like, can you think of some other times that God regretted things or? Uh, yeah, when was that? Yeah, before the flood, he regretted same kind of language. He regretted that he had made man because of what had happened, what had turned out. He regretted that he had made Saul king. I don't know. I'd have to check, but I think he. Uh, that was the other one. Yeah, but similar type of thing. He was sad that this had happened, and he was ready to completely wipe out the Israelites when they rebelled with the 10 spies, and they were ready to just turn around and go back to Egypt after God had done everything for them. He was going to just wipe them out and start fresh with Moses. So, um, again, this is one of those kind of words. Does God have regret in the same sense that we do? Well, no, that's a word that we use because that's all we can understand. We can't put it in God's terms, but because God knew exactly what would happen. But I mean, he can still be sad that it happened. I think is really what, especially given the opportunities that Saul's had. I mean, Samuel's been there for him to lean on if he so chose. I mean, he's been given the Spirit of God. We've seen several times. Yet, despite all these things, Saul's, I think, true nature is coming out here. His lack of desire for really that much in terms of spirituality. We kind of saw that at the beginning, and just clearly now it's a couple times now he's disobeyed God and gone against what he was supposed to. So this is just kind of the final straw, and Samuel's angry. He's crying out to the Lord. Yes, sir. In with Moses and Noah's, so same kind of situation. That word regret. All right, so early in the morning, let's see, verse 12. Early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul, but it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel where he set up a monument for himself. Then he turned around and went down to Gilgal. So, again, we're already seeing, there's no regret. There's regret with God, but there's not much regret with Saul. He's proud of himself for what he's done. We're going to say, later on, he says he did follow the instructions. So, but again, he sets up a monument for himself. Where did that victory come from? Did it come from Saul? No, this victory came from God. If anything, maybe it would have made the situation better if he'd acknowledged where that victory came from. But it was a large force, and there was this great and thorough victory. I mean, despite the fact that some of the people were spared and some of the best were spared. I mean, this was a complete and utter victory by the Israelites. It just wasn't to the full extent that God had commanded. Verse 13, when Samuel came down, Saul said, "May the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." This is one of those, if you've really done right and you've really done exactly what you're supposed to, do you need to say it? Like it's like I feel like he knows what he's done and he's kind of getting ahead of the situation, trying to, put words into Samuel's mouth or put words into God's mouth here and just like, oh, I've done everything you've asked me to. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. This is one of those tactics I guess you use when you're kind of guilty. You try to fill up the conversation with your own words that make it seem like it's not as bad as it seems. But Samuel, I love this. Samuel replied, Saul's trying to say, "I've carried out the Lord's instructions," and in the same moment, while he's saying that, there's evidence to the contrary in Samuel's ears, right there. It's like when if you've got little children, you walk in and like, did you do this? Did you make this mess? And they're standing around. There's evidence to all this mess all around them. Like, I don't know what happened. I don't know where this came from.
Well, and when you look at this from Saul's perspective, they're having this celebration, and one of the things that would have happened in that celebration is they would have executed the captives. They would have sacrificed these sheep. And so in Saul's mind, he may have been thinking, hey, these guys are about to die anyway. But the fact of the matter was, he didn't carry it out the way God had commanded. And so it's not just that he was going to leave everything alive anyway.
Yeah. These
things were marked for execution and sacrifice.
And when you think like percentage-wise, I mean, we don't see the number of people that he killed or the number of animals that he destroyed or cities that he destroyed in this entire campaign. Saul did. He saw all this, and he killed and destroyed 99.9% of everything he was supposed to. So when you think of it that way, you're like, well, that's an A plus, 99.9. That's a pretty good grade, right? But he still failed. Yeah, that's almost but lost is the kind of phrase I think about. Almost persuaded to be a Christian. Well, if you're almost a Christian, you're still not a Christian. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yep. For himself. Mm-hmm. And we'll see some of his excuses and things. He's very worried about himself, his image. He's very inward focused, and definitely not on obedience, on serving God, on worshiping in the proper way. We already saw that a couple chapters before. He was waiting on Samuel to arrive to offer the sacrifice, but all his men were leaving. So he decided to do the sacrifice himself. Why? Because he was so eager to serve God and sacrifice to him? No, because he was worried about losing his troops and losing the battle and saving face. So everything is very inward focused with Saul. And then Samuel, of course, he replies, what's the sound of the sheep and the goats and the cattle that I hear? And here's Saul's beginning of all his excuses. He answered, the troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep, goats, and cattle in order to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we destroyed. That's another one you'll notice. Whenever he talks about God in this chapter, I think it's 3 times, it's always the Lord your God in this chapter. He says it several times to Samuel. He never says the Lord our God or the Lord my God. It's always the Lord your God, and that's one of those, I guess, Freudian slips or something. You kind of see his focus, who his God was. It was not the Lord God, it was Saul. That was the person he was most concerned about, and we've seen that time and time again, and that's why God has appointed a man after his own heart, not a man after Saul's heart, my heart. It's a man after God's own heart that's going to replace Saul here. within the next chapter.
I also like in that response. So you pointed out that he refers to him as your God.
Mm-hmm.
He also says, the troops did the bad thing
Yeah.
in honor of your God, but we did it right.
Yeah, but the
Right?
rest
Like,
we destroyed.
right.
Yeah.
But everything I came across, I destroyed.
Yep.
They're the ones that brought him back, so I followed God's law. Right? Like,
It was the troops. The troops. What could I do? You know,
Right.
I'm only the king. I'm only the commander.
yeah.
You know, I don't have any power over them. Yeah. So I didn't notice the switch from you to we there.
But this shows the ability of Saul to rationalize his
Mhm.
wrongdoing, and it gives us insight into how people today will create these very fine
Mhm.
distinctions to justify themselves in their own eyes. That they'll make these disassociations so that they can live with themselves. Because if you know you've done wrong, if you know that you have sinned, it eats you up. But if you can somehow shift things,
Yeah.
it makes it easier to live with yourself.
And that's why Saul is so interesting, because he is, like I said, you know, there are certain characters in the Bible, or certain, you know, like the men of Sodom and Gomorrah, just completely, utterly wicked. Like we almost can't even we can't even sympathize or associate with them, because we would never do some of the stuff that they did. But a man like Saul, I think we tend to want to, you know, put him in that category of, you know, we have completely wicked and completely good, and then there's people like Saul that are really, I think, more like us than we'd really want to admit. Making excuses like this, rationalizing. You know, he's not out there just to do whatever he wants and not serve God. That's not his mindset, but that's what ends up happening because of his actions and his inward desire to serve himself. If you asked him, he'd say, I love God. I want to serve God. I want to obey God. He would say that, and I'm pretty sure he would mean that when he says it. He's not lying when he says something like that, but his actions kind of speak otherwise. And you know, even though he says something, we've got enough insight into his heart, I think, to see what is truly there, which of course God can see in a man's heart, even if that man can't even see it. I don't think, like you said, I don't think Saul even realized some of the things he was doing and saying, or didn't see himself as evil or wicked. He probably saw himself as a great king. Chuck, when y'all have a question, I thought I saw a hand. All right, so we blame the troops here, and Samuel just, you know, stop it. You know, like I mentioned, when you have a little kid, you know, his son or daughter making excuses, you don't let them finish. You just say, for lack of a better word, shut up. Just be quiet for a moment. You don't want to hear. Let them try to rationalize it, or let them talk anymore. We're gonna, you know, because it's not going to be true. It's not going to be the true assessment of what happened. Samuel's going to tell him what it is. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. So it's the Lord's statement that is going to be the true one here. Verse 17, Samuel continued, although you once considered yourself unimportant, haven't you become the leader of the tribes of Israel? What was Saul like kind of at the very beginning when he was yeah, when they went to make him king, where was he? He was hiding behind the baggage. You know, he seemed to be kind of a humble man. When Samuel was talking about making him king, he said, you know, am I not the least of my father's house and the smallest of tribes? He seemed to have some humility. He never saw himself as this great leader of Israel, even though he was tall and, you know, handsome and strong and a good warrior. I mean, he had some humility. He didn't expect to ever become king. I mean, he saw himself as unimportant, and yet here he is. He became the leader of the tribes of Israel. The Lord anointed you king over Israel in verse 18, and then sent you on a mission. And he repeats that mission. Go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have annihilated them. A little bit different from that first statement, but I mean, it means the same thing, right? Completely destroy, annihilate, do not spare them. This isn't like he didn't understand what God was saying. So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush on the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? Um, that's the issue here too. They saw all this plunder. They saw the good things that the Amalekites had, and even though they were set to completely destroy it, they couldn't help themselves. I mean, the people, and I think Saul here as well, he couldn't help but keep some of it back. Who does that remind you of? Think back to the book of Joshua. Achan there. If you remember when they attacked Jericho and destroyed, they were supposed to utterly destroy Jericho. Nothing was to come out of there except what they did. Any plunder was dedicated to God. All of that, it was the kind of the first fruits of their conquest of Canaan. So that entire city was dedicated to God, and then Achan kept just a little bit back, a couple little items, and because of that, in the next battle, they were defeated at Ai. And once they figured out what the issue was, Achan and his family were completely stoned, destroyed, completely wiped out because of that. And he had rushed and saw the plunder. This was evil in the Lord's sight. Saul's going to double down here. But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord gave me. Again, this is so funny because he says he obeys, but then his own words betray him. I brought back King Agag of Amalek, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. Those are completely those statements don't match up. I brought back, and I completely destroyed. You can only do one or the other. The troops, again, we're going to blame those troops for all the. He thinks that the issue is the sheep and the goats and the cattle and all those things. I think it's more, not destroying the Amalekites, but he's thinking more physically the plunder here. The troops brought back the plunder, the best of what was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So I think you mentioned, maybe he wasn't expecting to keep it all. He was thinking, I'll bring the best back and sacrifice all of that to God. Maybe he didn't intend to keep all of it. He just wanted to bring it back and sacrifice it. That seems like it'd go over well with God.
In his mind, the end result's the same.
Yeah.
But it wasn't keeping the command of the Lord.
And why would he keep the king alive? I would think, if this wicked nation, if anyone is the most guilty, it's the leadership, the king. To kill him at the celebration, like a trophy, maybe. Possibly too, he might have intended to completely spare him just because he is a king. He can think forward to the exile. Exactly. So there's a bond. There's kind of a bond between a king and another king, even if they're enemies. I think forward to the Babylonian captivity. When they came in, I forget which. I don't think it was the very last when Jerusalem was destroyed, but one of the first attacks. They took the king back to Babylon. Well, he ended up living there and living out his life, and eventually, I think it's one of the Jehoiakims, whichever one. He's actually the king brought him out of the dungeon and had him sit at the table with him. So that was not uncommon. You don't just wipe out everyone all the time. Sometimes you have a king almost as a trophy to say, hey, look, he was a king over a nation, and now he's living in my good graces, eating at the table next to me. So I'm a king of kings, is what the Babylonian emperor would think. So Saul is thinking the same thing. Maybe he's thinking, well, if I keep him alive, he can be a servant to me. And it's one thing to say I have servants, but my servants are former kings or former princes. That sounds a lot better. That shows that you are a mighty warrior and a conqueror. So that's a possibility. Of course, he could have just been saving him for the big Amalek party reception that they would have to celebrate the victory. But again, they set apart. This was all set apart for destruction, but we're going to save it for the Lord. There it is, the Lord your God at Gilgal, the end of verse 21. Then Samuel, this is kind of the most famous part of this whole passage. Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention or to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination. Defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So what was Saul worried about this whole time? Himself. It seems like he was more worried about the sacrifices. He was like, "Oh, I'm saving all this to sacrifice." The people brought all these things back to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and Samuel completely turns that upside down. He's like, "Does the Lord care about these sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord?" No, not at all. To obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And we do the same thing. We do the same thing by looking at someone else or looking at ourselves and say, hey, I'm at church 3 times a week. I do all these things. I'm up here teaching a Bible class. I'm preaching. I'm leading singing. Those are the sacrifice equivalents, I guess. Those visible things that everyone can see. But if I'm in my heart, if I'm at home lying and cheating and doing all these other things during the rest of the week, is the Lord just like, well, he sacrificed, so he's good. He's up there preaching and teaching, so he's good. No, it's about obeying the Lord, and of course, that goes down into our heart, right? That's going to be the key with David. His heart was into it. His heart was dedicated to God, and from that came obedience and sacrifices and all, which is a part of that. It's not the sacrifices that were the beginning; it's the heart that from that emanates out obedience and sacrifices and love for God and all those other things. And so look what he equates it with. Verse 23, for rebellion is like the sin of divination, and defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. He's equating what Saul has done with he ramps it up a notch. Rebellion, sin of divination, that would have been sorcery. That was one of the worst things they could have done. Uh, Wickedness, idolatry, defiance. I mean, all these, up until this point, we're just like, so he didn't quite obey God. Well, that's the same as all of these other things. Just like when Paul the apostle, he's listing all, several times throughout the Gospels, throughout the epistles, he's listing all those sins, and we're like, okay, homosexuality, murder, yeah, that makes sense. And then it's like disobedient to parents or something that we would say, hey, that doesn't equate with murder and whatever else is in there. All these, when he's making those lists, some don't really make sense to us. Well, all of these things are rebellion and sin and defiance and wickedness and idolatry. These are the same in God's eyes. And what does that mean? That means that Saul has rejected God's word. Uh, he heard God's word. He heard the rule. He heard the law. He heard the mission, and he decided not to do it. Even though he did it 99%, he still rejected the word of the Lord, and the result is the same. Just like the Amalekites, their punishment was equal to the crime. They attacked and wanted to destroy an innocent people when they were at their weakest, so they were attacked and destroyed. You'll see that throughout the scriptures that the punishment always fits the crime, no matter what. I love how in the story of the Tower of Babel, the people built this tower and they were building this city to not be scattered. So what is their punishment? Their language is scattered. They're scattered across the face of the earth. The punishment fit the crime all the time. So same thing here. You rejected God. the God is going to reject you from being king. Yes, sir.
One more note on the sacrifice. I feel like King David learned a lesson from this.
Hmm.
I don't know where he was during this, but he learned a lesson in 2 Samuel when he's buying the land for the temple. God says, "Look, I'll give you the
Yeah.
land. I'll give it to you." He says, "No, I won't offer to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing."
Yeah.
These sacrifices it looked really good. It was this huge bonfire. It cost them nothing.
Hmm.
It wasn't their mess. It wasn't theirs. It was somebody else's. At least somebody learned a lesson.
And even all these, okay, that sounds great. He kept all the best back from the plunder, but that wasn't even his to begin with. He took it from the Amalekites. It wasn't any sacrifice. It's just like if someone, if I find $20 on the ground and then I put it in the collection plate. Well, that's nice, but that wasn't a sacrifice. It was just luck that I found it on the ground, and that wasn't giving really. That was just passing it along, basically.
Saul had a major problem with authority.
Hmm.
That's the big, scary, nasty word that we don't like to talk about because people get offended. But I mean, that's the fatal flaw of Saul. We have a measure of authority that God has given us, and if we operate outside that scope of practice, we're wrong. Period. You are guilty of all of it if you cross that line. And then his later fatal flaw that we see, not to jump too far ahead, but I mean, he gets paranoid. And the worst paranoia is paranoia with a grain of truth from getting it.
Yeah.
He had this guilt that he was living with because he knew he was wrong, and he just devolves into this mess of psychosis because he's just paranoid because he knows the end's coming, and he doesn't want to fall in line. That's the point. God says, fall in line, do as I command you.
And it's so tough for him, speaking about authority, because, he is the king. He is the ultimate authority, except I would still want to put Samuel ahead of him because Samuel has a connection to God's word. But over time, maybe early in Saul's reign, he leaned on Samuel, but it seems like that leaning has turned into, well, I'm the king, you're just a prophet. Well, that prophet is, it was said about him that God's word never failed when he spoke it. What Samuel said came true. So I think that gives Samuel a little bit more authority, and of course God as well gives him that authority over Saul, and Saul doesn't.
I think what we've
He
also
did that.
missed in this conversation is the pressure Saul would have felt from his people.
Mm-hmm.
Because kings wouldn't go and destroy another nation, put their people at risk, and not get something out of it. Right? So
Yeah.
It was very contrary to popular opinion and the way that kings conquered other nations to leave nothing. Right? Like to just destroy it, to risk your people and come home empty-handed.
Look at verse 24. It kind of leads to that right there. Saul finally says, okay, I've sinned. I've transgressed the Lord's command. Because I was afraid of the people, I obeyed them. So maybe he doesn't have a problem with authority. He obeyed the people, so he can obey somebody. He just obeyed the wrong people. I would assume this is more of an excuse than as much truth. But there could have been the people have overturned his rule before. If you think back to when he wanted to kill his own son Jonathan for breaking that vow, the people redeemed him. They said, no, no, no. Even though you're king, you're not going to kill Jonathan for something stupid like that. So the people are willing to go against the king. So maybe that story, there's a reminder in his mind about that. But look what he immediately says. We think, okay, I have sinned. Well, that sounds pretty good. David said that when Nathan came to him about the sin of Bathsheba, and we know that he was forgiven for that. So that sounds really good. Well, you got to read on. Look at verse 25. Now, therefore, please forgive my sin and return with me so I can worship the Lord. Why does he want Samuel to return with him? So we can look good. He paints it as, hey, forgive my sin and come back and worship with me. But he needs to have a unity between the two leaders, Samuel and Saul. It looks bad if they're fighting against each other because again, Samuel is a prophet. Saul is a king; he's not a prophet. So there needs to be some agreement. It would look bad for Saul more than anything because Samuel's been around for a while. He still has some authority. He still has, I think, the ear of the people in some way. Samuel says, I will not return with you because you rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. When Samuel turned to go, Saul grabbed the corner of his robe and it tore. This is interesting. To me, this doesn't sound like he's fallen on his face, humility. This sounds like don't turn your back on me. I'm the king. Get back over here. And he grabs him and it tears. And Samuel uses that to almost as a parable here. The Lord has torn the kingship of Israel away from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Furthermore, the Eternal One of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man who changes his mind. Saul again says, I have sinned. And immediately afterward, he's focused on himself again. Please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel. He's still concerned about saving face in this situation. He doesn't want to be embarrassed. He doesn't want to seem like there's conflict between him and God. He wants to feel like God was with him and that it was, because Saul is the best king, that they had victory. Come back with me so I can bow and worship to the Lord. Last time here, the Lord your God. And Samuel actually does go back with him. He's following Saul, and Saul bowed down to the Lord. But I think this is because Samuel had some unfinished business. Saul had, he was told to destroy the Amalekites. And notice this whole time, Samuel's been getting on to him, telling him what he's done wrong. He hasn't obeyed. Saul could have, if he'd done it the right way, he could have said, I've sinned, and then fix the situation. But this whole conversation, this whole time, I don't know how long this lasts, but he's done nothing to rectify the situation. So now it's up to Samuel to fulfill and complete the Lord's mission. Samuel said, bring me King Agag of Amalek. Agag came to him trembling, for he thought, certainly the bitterness of death has come. Samuel declared, as your sword has made women childless, as your mother will be childless among women, so your mother will be childless among women. Then he hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Again, the punishment fits the crime. Agag has done wicked things, made women childless, so now the punishment will fit him. And it's Samuel that has to perform this pretty grisly act. I always kind of wonder because we don't really see Samuel even way back in 1 Samuel chapter 8 when he's kind of with the army, with the people, and the Philistines attack, and the Lord gives them victory. We don't really see Samuel leading the armies out and fighting and wielding a sword. So it'd be one thing for a trained soldier to, hack someone to pieces. I mean, they've done that before. They've been in battles. That would not, I imagine, I don't know that I would be able to do that because I've never killed anyone or been in a war or seen, I'm not a nurse or anything, so I haven't seen blood and guts and all that. That seems so foreign to me, and I wonder if how foreign that was to Samuel. I mean, yes, he's a priest, so I guess he's hacked up some sacrifices before, but doing that to a person is a little different. Yet here he is. He doesn't even miss a beat. He is killing this guy because that's exactly what the Lord commanded him. This is CSB. To say something different with
verse 32 is different in
Totally opposite.
Okay, let's see. I'll see what I've got ESV up here. Oh yeah, ESV says cheerfully. Yeah. Yeah, I think I would agree. That's probably not the best translation there. It seems like he comes with a little more joyfully because he thinks that he's going to survive.
Yeah, the word that's translated trembling, it's only used once in the Old Testament, and so So possible definitions are hard to
Yeah,
determine.
that's one of those tricky ones. So we'll finish. Yep. We'll pick up here in chapter 16, but notice from that day forward to the day of his death, Samuel never saw Saul again. And Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted he had made Saul. So kind of an end cap to that story. But when Samuel, because of this and the rejection of Saul, he'll never see him again until after he's dead. We'll see that as well. So that'll be interesting. All right, so we'll start in chapter 16 on Wednesday. Try not to spend too much time in chapter 16 because we want to get to chapter 17, which will be David and Goliath, and spend the bulk of our time there. Thank you.